Welcome, everybody. We're just going to wait for a few more people to come into the room, and then we will begin. Looks like we got a lot of people coming on, which is great. Good to see. Okay. I'm going to wait 2 more seconds. Okay. Welcome to Gen Z and U.S. foreign policy. Is this where the status quo meets its match? A co-sponsored event by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the John Quincy Adams Society. This is a first for us, sponsoring with our friends at John Quincy. So I'm very grateful and proud to be introducing our panel today. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am a senior advisor for QI and editorial director for our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. If you are joining us at QI for the first time, welcome. And if you're not familiar with us, the Quincy Institute is a think tank dedicated to promoting a U.S. foreign policy of diplomatic engagement with the world rather than using the military to resolve problems or to defend U.S. interests overseas. We are also committed to realigning national security with sound strategy based on America's interests, including an end to endless wars that sustain global conflict and drain U.S. resources abroad. I'm pretty excited about this panel today. While the idea of dissecting and predicting how a new generation thinks and behaves is certainly not new, Gen Z poses an interesting dynamic for discussion. Gen X grew up in the shadow of Vietnam and boomers in the shadow of World War II. Millennials watched 9/11 unfold as school children in their classrooms. But Zoomers never knew anything but endless war and failed war strategies and policies. How does this shape the way they see foreign policy, and might they get us out of the endless cycle of militarism that has dominated Washington for the last 70 years? I'm going to turn to my co-host, John Allen Gay, who is executive director of the John Quincy Adams Society, a national network for student groups centered on a vision of foreign policy restraint. And he's also the co-author with Jeffrey Kemp of War with Iran, Political, Military, and Economic Consequences. John, take it away.
Thank you, Kelly. And a little full disclosure at the beginning of the panel, I'm not myself a member of Gen Z. I was born during the Reagan administration, but I have helped a ton of Gen Z folks launch their careers in foreign policy through my work with the JQA Society, because we're helping people in college and in their early careers who want to change the status quo in foreign policy. And naturally, one element of the future of American foreign policy is the people who will be making American foreign policy in the future, and the people who will be part of the future American society. And members of Generation Z, who are currently in their teens and 20s, are now entering into the political space. They appear to largely be continuing the millennial turn away from establishment positions, including on foreign policy. There's a lot of areas where perceptions are just different from what you see in Gen X, boomers, and above. So what will the impact of this transition be? I mean, obviously, it's too soon to tell in detail, but there are some clues that are emerging. And I think to riff on Kelly's point about life experiences and what people grew up with, there is a rich vein of research in political science into what are known as cohort effects, generations and how they form their political attitudes. There's research in particular by Yair Gitza and Andrew Gelman, which found that the foundation of partisan presidential voting trends peaks around the ages of 14 to 24, that your experiences, whether you see a good president of one party or a bad president of one party, one that's popular or unpopular, will really affect your attitudes to that party long term and your voting behavior. Trevor Thrall, who's with Cato and George Mason University, put out a report a few years ago on millennials in foreign policy, and discussing this research said, according to their model, events at age 18 have roughly 3 times the impact on partisan voting preferences as events that occur at age 40. And experiences past the age of 45 have no statistically significant impact at all. So Thrall has said that for millennials, the 9/11 attacks, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the Great Recession, the election of the first African-American president in U.S. history, that these are a lot of the events that are going to be shaping millennials' attitudes. And being a millennial myself, I can testify that these events were formative for me, for a lot of my peers. Many of us went into foreign policy, that those of us that are working in the foreign policy space, because of our memories of 9/11 and how that really shocked us into paying attention to what was happening in the outside world, or because we remember the run up to the invasion of Iraq and then how badly that conflict went. Many of us were also entering the labor market during the Great Recession and its aftershocks, which I think has impacted our economic attitudes. So what about Generation Z? They're born by most demographic reckoning will typically say 1995 to 1997 is the beginning of the Gen Z birth year range, and that range ends around 2009 to 2012. So for the oldest members of Gen Z, that formative 14 to 24 period is going to be coming around 2009 to 2021. So it's just starting to wrap up. For the youngest members of Gen Z, that formative period has yet to happen. It would be 2023 to 2036. So much of Generation Z is still in its most politically impactful formative years. Many in the core of Generation Z will be born after 9/11. The big presidencies that are going to be shaping them are Obama, Trump, Biden, and whoever comes next. Many of the folks in the middle and lower half of Gen Z are still in education, which means the educational disruption brought about by the coronavirus pandemic is likely to be another formative experience for them. In the specific realm of foreign policy, it is putting it very charitably to say we have had mixed success in their lifetime. The war in Afghanistan, I think, is the case in point. You know, a lot of people growing up around the military myself, a lot of people who go off to war will say, I'm going so that my kids don't have to. And right now we are sending Generation Z soldiers to Afghanistan who were those kids, some of whom were born after our involvement in the conflict there even began. So to dig into this context a little bit, I have some real live members of the older cohort of Generation Z here for this conversation. Before we get going, just a reminder that you can drop your questions in the Q&A feature below. I'll be curating them. But joining me on our panel conversation, first off is Natalie Dowzicki. She is the manager of libertarianism.org and an alumna of Young Voices, where her foreign policy writing appeared in the Washington Times, the Washington Examiner, the American Conservative, and the National Interest. She's also the co-host of the pop culture and politics podcast, Pop and Lock. That's Lock like John Locke, L-O-C-K-E. You can follow her work on Twitter at Nat_Dowzicki. Sam Fraser is a communications associate at the Quincy Institute and an assistant editor at Responsible Statecraft. He holds a BA in international relations from Claremont McKenna College, where his studies centered on U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. He conducted research on human rights and transitional justice in Argentina, and his undergraduate thesis focused on the longstanding impunity of members of the foreign policy elite. His writing has appeared in Responsible Statecraft, and you can follow him on Twitter at SXMFRXSER. That's Sam Fraser with the A's replaced with X's. Last but not least, Layla Ujeli is an associate editor at Inkstick Media and a graduate student of public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, where she is a Rhodes Scholar. She holds a master's degree in film aesthetics from the University of Oxford and a double BS in English and International Relations from the Ohio State University. She previously worked on reimagining U.S. security as a Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow at Win Without War. You can follow her at Layla Ujeli. So Natalie, how about you kick us off and tell us some of what you've found digging into this polling of rising generations and their attitudes toward foreign policy?
Yeah, sure. So before jumping right into the numbers, I'm just going to put it out there that it's important to note that we can put the youngest voting bloc under a microscope all day long and still not really fully understand why they think the way that they do. But for our discussion today, I think there are two big buckets of polling to understand. So first, it's the decline of institutional trust that's happening across all adults in the US. And then, of course, it's the nitty gritty of how Gen Z specifically thinks about certain foreign policy issues. So for the numbers, it's no secret that confidence and trust in our institutions has drastically declined across the adult population. So in 1973, when this question was first asked, 52% of adults had confidence in our president and 42% of adults had confidence in Congress. And when we fast forward to 2019, and the same question was asked, and 38% of adults had confidence in our president, and only 11% of adults had confidence in Congress. And the question was phrased around doing the right thing. So doing what the population viewed as what's best for the country. And we'll get more into the weeds of how this, let's call it state skepticism, affects how we think about foreign policy, but it's important to know that that trend is happening. And then on specific foreign policy issues, according to a variety of studies done by the Center for American Progress, the Cato Institute, as John was saying earlier, 64% of Zoomers favor prioritizing economic and diplomatic efforts over specifically military action. So, I mean, very simply, to kind of call back to a confidence indicator that I mentioned just a second ago, we have very little confidence in America's ability to use military force effectively and appropriately. And I think that's kind of what that number shows. Also, 68% of Zoomers or Gen Zers, whatever we want to call them, believe in order to remain competitive in the world and abroad, the United States needs to invest more to improve our own domestic problems. So that's with infrastructure, education, healthcare, and not just increase military and defense spending. Now, we've been hearing a lot, this term being thrown around, especially with the Biden administration, about foreign policy starting at home, and that could be an indicator of that mindset. And of course, this polling context would not really be complete without mentioning climate change. So that's a really big difference between Zoomers and millennials specifically, but even our parents and our grandparents. Half of Zoomers say U.S. foreign policy should prioritize combating climate change, while only 12% say we should focus on countering Chinese aggression. So that's definitely an interesting comparison. These polls are obviously broad brushstrokes, and they only help us give context to our discussion today. And I have to also mention, in the study I was looking at, especially from the Center for American Progress, the Zoomers, they polled, a lot of them had great responses, but then still some of them said they hadn't formed their foreign policy views completely yet. So that's just saying that they haven't been exposed to a variety of ideas in order to actually understand how they're feeling. And I don't know, these numbers might be surprising to some of you. They're not all that surprising to me, but I think throughout the rest of our discussion, you'll see how this new, fresh perspective will breathe some, let's call it a much needed fresh air into foreign policy debates.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I think just to dig in a bit to people forming their views, I think to give folks some examples of what this looks like in practice, maybe we can just go around the panel and talk about some of the events in our lifetimes that most shaped our own perceptions. Maybe Layla, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for this conversation, and I think it's an incredibly important one to have. So I think, like a lot of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans within the United States, my perception of foreign policy was really shaped by identity. So foreign policy wasn't very much a foreign thing. It was really local. So I only really distantly remember 9/11, but I do remember my parents pulling me out of school and these vague memories of rushing to put up an American flag. And then a year or two later, driving over to the park on the 4th of July and being yelled at through the car to like go back to Iraq. And these are experiences that many Arab Americans and many Muslim Americans have, because the conversations that were being had around the dinner table were about surveillance, were about the fact that the US was at war with people who looked like us. And also, we already had families in those regions. So I'm Syrian American, and I think all Americans, we care about our grandparents. So when I think about making sure that my grandma has access to medicine and security, we're talking about, US policy towards Syria around the dinner table. So these are issues that are incredibly local. And as the demographics in the United States shift, we need to be really cognizant of the fact that the way we used to think about foreign policy as something over there is not the case for many young Americans who are growing up now. And that really is a motivating factor for why I know I am in the foreign policy and national security space, but a lot of others who look like me are in this space, because we realized that US foreign policy affected us directly and we weren't in the room to talk about them.
And along those lines, Layla, some of the demographic numbers show that Generation Z is the most likely to have immigrant parents or to come from an immigration background themselves. Let's pivot over to Sam.
Yeah, so I think to tie into some of what you talked about with the different experiences, different events that have shaped cohorts of Americans, from the boomers to Gen X to millennials to Gen Z. If you look at what those were, older generations grew up, in the light of the post-war era and the Cold War. The Gen X specifically saw the fall of the Soviet Union. They saw the kind of 1990s heyday of liberal internationalism and humanitarian interventionism. But for millennials and younger, we have pretty much exclusively seen 9/11, the Iraq War, the war on terror, and we've seen these conflicts drag out endlessly to no obvious return for anyone. So this has an extraordinary effect on shaping how you see the world. And I think also when these events happen in your life changes how you process them. I think that people who remember those earlier times in American foreign policy have an easier time rationalizing the recent mistakes as mistakes instead of as symptoms that are somewhat inherent to America's approach to the world more broadly, which is how I've come to see them over the past few years. And this hasn't been a straightforward process for me where, the Iraq war started when I was 5 years old and I immediately thought this is a disaster. It's been a much more gradual process of learning and asking questions, and that leading to yet more questions. And I think, over time, I've gone back through the decades of American foreign policy and seen how the recent disastrous interventions in the Middle East relate to things that were done in prior decades, such as the Vietnam War, and how those things stem out of the militarized foreign policy, the militarized hegemony that the United States pursues more broadly.
Natalie, how about you?
Yeah. For me, as you were mentioning earlier, John, this idea of the critical period and kind of when that critical period occurs, and the idea that during this critical period, your beliefs are a bit more sticky. And what immediately stuck out to me kind of about this critical period that I guess I'm at the end of now, which is kind of a weird thought, but is the way that young people consume news and the type of news that we're exposed to nowadays, whether it be through Twitter or through the 24-hour news cycle. It's not hard to see why, let's say in the last 5 years, Zoomers have come out thinking much differently than our parents, just based off of the type of news and the cadence in which we're consuming our news has changed drastically in the last, let's say, decade. I wouldn't say like my other two panelists, I don't have like a formative moment that's equivalent to the invasion of Iraq or the Vietnam War, like other generations have. But I do think the constant failures and the negative attention, negative outcomes we hear about the news from a foreign policy perspective, but from a larger perspective as well, has kind of eroded my belief that America is acting in its best interests abroad, or let's say or that it's always doing so. So I think the news and the 24-hour cycle kind of really affects how I've formed like my opinions.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking for myself, to show some of the differences being a mid to older millennial, I definitely remember 9/11 very clearly because I was in eighth grade at the time, and was living in Northern Virginia. My father was working at the Pentagon. Thankfully, he made it out. But that was a very shaping experience for me. But I had actually been aware of Al Qaeda, for example, previously to that. I followed international events rather closely, I think, because I grew up in a military family where this was a bit of a kitchen table issue. And there's the saying that war is how Americans learn geography, and that I think was true for me. But the Iraq War, I think, was a particularly formative experience for me. And I've heard a number of other millennials state similar things, that this war that was in many ways a war of choice, that was something that you knew was coming for a while because it was being pushed, as opposed to something that we were pushed into, and then that had all of this optimism around it, and then went disastrously. And I will say, to go with that, the questions about trust in institutions, I'd contrast that with when we went into Afghanistan. I thought like, oh man, we're going to have a transformative impact there. I remember I had seen photos of North and South Korea at night, and how South Korea is so much more lit up, and I thought that's what Afghanistan is going to look like next to its neighbors after we've helped them. And I think we are still there, and that has not really happened, to put it lightly. So it is a very different life experience for those coming up in Gen Z, even from millennials. Let's talk some more about some of these differences. We talked a little bit earlier about climate change in particular, and I know I've been helping grade a bunch of essays that for the John Quincy Adams Society's essay contest, and one of the options people had, and these are college students answering questions. One of the options people had was to identify 3 national security defense priorities for the new administration. And a whole lot of folks, one of those was climate change. And I'm, coming from my generation, I'm not sure that was how we thought of it. We thought of it as an issue, but it wasn't something that uniformly would have been identified like that. And I'm curious for you all's thoughts on this issue in particular and how it's playing among Gen Z.
So I can jump in here, just building on our previous point about these sticky times and these formative times in our lifetimes. And I think, John, earlier you mentioned that, by the age of 18, we're 3 times more likely to form an opinion on our voting preferences, as opposed to events that happen at the age of 40. And this is something we discussed in the run-up to this conversation. So it really had me thinking about what was going on at the time that I was 18. So I'm 24 now. So I was 18 back in 2014. And when I was scrolling through the news headlines of the day, it was that the 2014 was the warmest year on record. Mike Brown was just killed by police in Ferguson. There was an Ebola outbreak in West Africa that became a global health crisis. And ISIS declared itself a caliphate in Raqqa. So when you really kind of look at 2014 to 2021, we see almost the same challenges that we face now, right? Where there's this massive health crisis There's this national reckoning with police brutality and racial injustice. And there's these conflicts that are going on around the globe at the backdrop of what we've been told repeatedly is the existential threat of the climate crisis. And I think for the longest time, Gen Z knows the challenges that are facing us. Like, we know that the climate crisis is going to be bad and that we don't have the health infrastructure necessary to respond to a global pandemic, and that these authoritarian powers are rising, and that there's all these mass inequalities that are prompting more conflict. But instead of just seeing these problems emerge, we're also seeing the consequences of the status quo failing to respond to them, right? It doesn't even look like the status quo even shares this perception of the risks facing us. And it doesn't seem that even if they tried, they'd be capable of responding adequately given the current priorities that it has. So I think it's less about kind of the issues that Gen Z identifies and more about the failure to actually respond to issues that we've seen for a long time coming.
And I'd just jump in and add a note about climate change in particular. It's always, as Layla was said, it's always been like an existential threat. It's always like something that we're going to have to tackle down the road. And that was like harped on us and harped on us and harped on us in school, and in college, and even now, it still seems like to us that it's not something that's ever been addressed. So it's like, oh, okay, this is going to be on our plate then. And I think that kind of really came to the forefront, let's say in like, I think it was like 2018 when Greta Thunberg, did her whole thing. And it became even it came in the spotlight even more about how much we weren't doing for climate change in particular. And again, a lot of these challenges that we're facing that Layla mentioned, some of them are domestic, but now they're turning into global issues. They're turning into global challenges, which is going to change kind of the work that foreign policy needs to do and the scope of the work that's considered foreign policy. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about like that whole idea that like foreign policy can start at home and there are things to take care of at home first.
Sam, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think the point about the sort of dissonance between the rhetoric that we've spent our whole lives hearing on climate change and then the corresponding actions that have been taken on the issue is very important. It's been very impactful to me. Just for instance, I think it's about half of the carbon emissions that have been emitted since the beginning of human civilization have come after 1990. So after we knew exactly what the problem was, what this was doing to our planet and our ability to survive, we continued and have continued to emit carbon at a rate that is ever increasing. So just to be told that this is the biggest threat facing our future, and yet to see such a lack of urgency in doing anything about it is very jarring. And I think we're continuing to see now, the national security establishment is saying more and more that climate change is the number one security threat. It's become a more popular thing to say, yet that isn't reflected. It hasn't been reflected at all in their actions. They're still much more attuned to traditional security threats, whether it's, continuing to wage the global war on terror or pivoting towards conflict with China. And it deeply contradicts what we've been told all our lives is the bigger problem.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a theme here that these are structural issues that don't necessarily fit into the traditional national buckets. This is something the United States can do. This is something that can be addressed by one country or one small group of countries. In many cases, these are issues that cut across borders, or they are issues that are almost prior to foreign policy. The lens of things about our internal character as a nation, the character of our society, the way we spend our money. that these are bigger than what one nation can do, or they are smaller or more local rather than foreign policy. Any thoughts here?
So I would put a little note that it's not that Zoomers are like all that different from millennials in the sense, especially in these topics. And I think that it's important to stress that like it's the needle that's turning a certain way, and not necessarily that we're just like have all these new ideas and going to change everything. And kind of to your point, John, that the question that you were just asking, I think we're seeing a lot of the internal issues that haven't been addressed, and for the longer time that they haven't been addressed, the bigger they get, at least in our eyes. And I think there's going to be a time where that threshold is too high to ignore. We're going to reach a point where it's going to be too high to ignore things like climate change, or we're in the middle. Let's not say the middle, hopefully towards the end of a global pandemic, and things like that are very clear that we need to fix internally before we go and fix other things. And it's also important to note that, like, let's say, like, if we're looking at America's perspective on our influence abroad, there has been a huge decline in like Americans thinking that we should be the policeman around the world. And we had discussed this in prior chats, but we're not all that different from millennials thinking that. That hasn't been a drastic change, but the changes we're talking about are more drastic, let's say, from our grandparents to us rather than the cohort before us, if that makes sense.
I also think that there's something about the nature of these challenges that is somewhat unique, right? So the reality is, for the climate crisis, the US can't go it alone. And if the US decides to wait until something catastrophic happens stateside, I mean, we're seeing fires and everything, but for something truly catastrophic, the other parts of the world are going to face it much faster and much sooner. And that's the sad reality of the climate crisis, is that countries in the global south will be feeling the most severe and immediate impacts first. And I think that, as Natalie said earlier on the issue of the news media, we're seeing visually what that would look like. And we're seeing the impact that has on other people. And because, you know, our world is much more globalized, as is our media, we do care about those voices and we're listening to them. So those advocates and those activists around the world, I think, are having a really resonant message. And if we continue to listen to them, that's going to continue to shape the views of Gen Z as they enter this political space. And I think even talking about the coronavirus pandemic and the way vaccinations will roll out, we're watching it and we're like, even if the US manages to get its cases under control, as long as COVID-19 exists in another country and is mutating in different forms, then the US Americans are still not safe. So we're seeing these threats as increasingly interconnected, and that the best way we achieve them isn't by putting on an America First cap and thinking exclusively of US national security. Instead, we see security as this more interconnected global phenomenon that we have to uplift both at home and abroad.
To add to that, I think that climate change and pandemics both, as you say, represent issues where they can't be neatly put in the bucket of foreign or domestic policy. It won't work. To address either issue, you need to be taking coordinated action at home and abroad. On climate, for instance, you cannot have, U.S. foreign policy trying to push other countries to adopt some, more ambitious international agreements and targets on how we are going to decarbonize their economies, while we are unable to pass anything, any legislation to do the same thing here at home. And I think that US political structures are maybe increasingly incapable of handling that problem. We'll have to see how it plays out over the next few years. But obviously, because of polarization and political deadlock here at home, we are currently incapable of taking the major steps we need to synchronize our domestic policy with the ambitious foreign policy goals that we'd like to have and that we need to have around an issue as urgent as climate change.
Absolutely. And so let's zoom out a bit here to some of these implications of the entry of Generation Z into the professional foreign policy space and just into society, political society more broadly. One of the things that, I'm going to start drawing on some of these questions in the Q&A, folks, keep throwing them in. One of the things that struck me that Natalie, I believe, pointed out earlier was about an increasing doubt about the ability of American force to be the solver of global problems, and that more broadly, the view that we can be in the words of a millennial era movie, Team America World Police, there's a lot more skepticism of that. And I think more broadly, thinking through these cohort experiences, it seems to me that a lot of older foreign policy practitioners, for example, from Gen X, were really shaped by these periods in the late 80s and early 90s where there was this feeling of an almost linear historical progress. You have the 1989 revolutions, you have the relatively peaceful, more integrated, globalizing era of the 1990s. Everything feels like it's connecting and coming together. I mean, there were a lot of problems in the 90s, but this was the kind of arc of the narrative. You have, Francis Fukuyama saying history has ended, that this is a natural foundation for idealism, for a kind of crusading idealism in foreign policy that's trying to move history forward toward, an eventual liberal institutional global imperium. But that if you're growing up post 2000, it looks more like a regress or a return to some sort of cyclical history. Again, as Leo pointed out, ISIS declared its caliphate, and also there were people coming up in Western societies who had the things that the folks in the 90s were saying, hey, this is what everybody wants, who were living in Western society saying, I reject that. I'm going to go join ISIS or join other illiberal and even violent movements. That we've experienced economic stagnation, pandemics. The presidency of Trump, in the eyes of a lot of people, was a break in the political narrative of the United States. We've seen a lot of domestic fragmentation, rising authoritarianism abroad instead of rising democratization. And this could even, in fact, be a foundation for greater realism in the pursuit of foreign policy, or for simply a more skeptical attitude, again, about the capacity of United States power to do that much that is structurally transformative. But let's broaden this out even further. What's it going to take to mobilize Gen Z more into foreign policy? What does Gen Z get excited about? What does the career space in foreign policy look like if you're coming up in Gen Z, especially if you have a lot of these common attitudes that are fairly skeptical of the current foreign policy power structure? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So there's been kind of an opportunity to mobilize Zoomers into to make meaningful foreign policy changes. Now, having certain beliefs doesn't automatically translate to policy actions or policy changes. And I mean, you can see that right now, the electorate doesn't always agree with exactly what policy changes come through. But it has been the case for the last, I don't know how many decades, that if you're seen as more hawkish in the foreign policy space, it's much easier to get a job. But we are seeing some good progress in moving, like I was saying earlier, moving the needle. And we found that a lot of restrainers, or like the restraint camp in general, is a bit broader than it used to be. So it can have anyone from isolationists to restrainers on only certain topics. And I think that's really important to kind of like bringing in more people with this, let's call it skeptical mindset, skeptical of like state action, or and there's also a tendency to be a little bit cynical about this. And I want to stay away from being negative or cynical, because these new ideas and bringing them into the foreign policy space, specifically in the working space, are all good things. We, like John said earlier, there's a lot that's happened in foreign policy in the last, let's call it our formative years, that hasn't been great. So if there are any ways we can help improve that to me is a bonus. So I don't see why we wouldn't embrace this change, but historically speaking, it has been rather difficult if you're not as hawkish to really get involved in the foreign policy space. But that has been changing ever since, let's call it the so-called blob has been becoming less and less influential, and leaving some space open for more restrainers and those types of isolationist type.
If I can pick up on Natalie's point there, I think it's really important not to just count on generational turnover being the agent of change here, just because young people broadly tend to think one way, not one way, but tend towards a more, restrained foreign policy, does not mean that as our generation fills more, spaces of power, that we'll automatically see foreign policy go in that direction. I think because of the sort of patterns of recruitment and education and socialization that bring people into the foreign policy establishment, they tend to recruit and produce people who have more hawkish views and who are more inclined towards an interventionist, activist foreign policy. So, as Natalie touched on, it's important that we actually organize groups, institutions who are counter to the foreign policy status quo. And then a big part of this is also democratizing U.S. foreign policy, because as of right now, it is the space of policy making in this country that is probably the least susceptible to democratic pressure. And I think that might explain the gulf in some of the actions that the current administration is taking between its domestic and foreign policy. So it's not going to be easy, and there's no simple, set of steps you can list for how to do this. But I think opening up more democratic space for participation and input in foreign policy making is absolutely vital to all of the efforts we're talking about.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I think that there's this cliche that's out there that, young people have these idealistic ideas about the world and that they believe in restraint, they're more liberal, they're maybe on the left or progressive. But once they get into the professional world and once they see how the world works, they'll eventually become jaded and cynical and more pragmatic, because they're going to see how the world works. And to be honest, I don't think that that's going to happen for Gen Z as much, because I don't think that our perspectives on foreign policy are really dependent on our idealism or this sort of naive idealism. They're mostly based on just evidence, right? The ways the US has been engaging with the world to solve these major crises have not worked. And the status quo is failing to change to resolve these threats. And I think the place where we start to lose Gen Z, and I don't think we should take it for granted that just because we'll continue to hold these views, that policy will change, is that there's a perception of US foreign policy in our generation as stagnant and unchanging. So if our values fundamentally differ with this stagnant status quo, I think young people might have a reluctance to enter these institutions, right? Because they don't necessarily want to be working to support a system that misaligns with the way they view the world. So I think we need to do this thing, as Sam said, about democratizing foreign policy and improving access and allowing young people with these different perspectives to actually succeed and advance in some of the more blobby spots of foreign policy. That way, that when the guard eventually changes, there's enough people with these views who are there to kind of take the reins and really achieve the change in foreign policy that we want to see. But I don't think we should just take it for granted. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually reaching out to young people and saying, actually, you are empowered to make this change and we can help you do this.
Yeah, to echo what Layla was saying, if you're a young person, you're thinking, hey, I want to be part of that, talk to me. You could find my email online. This is kind of what I do in my day job is try to really help people enter the foreign policy space. And I will say, in spite of all these challenges, I'm overwhelmed every day by the caliber of young people who want to enter into the foreign policy space at all levels. They certainly have their heads screwed on a lot straighter than I did when I was their age. But speaking of young people, we've got a question from Jan Gerber over at the New American Engagement Initiative at the Atlantic Council, who asks, I worry about the rhetoric around great power competition, the role of China as painted by both mainstream and social media in the coronavirus pandemic. From the polling you mentioned, it looks like competition with China is not a priority for Gen Z. But if most of Gen Z is going through its formative period right now, it's likely that this generation will grow up seeing China as enemy number one. What can we do about this? And Natalie, I believe you've written about this issue.
Yeah, I've written about the polling. I have not entirely tackled the issue with China, but then again, no one has. So I think there's two ways to look at this. I think it is critical that the time period right now, the way that the news is framing our problems with China and our competition with China is very important to how Gen Z will continue to think about that issue. But I think another aspect of this is trying to avoid the rhetoric that this is the new Cold War. I know that I've read a lot of different pieces on this, but trying to avoid rhetoric like that is certainly going to help avoid escalate a situation. And mind you, if you're painting a picture that's doom and gloom with China, you're going to think it's important that you now know that you're going to affect an entire generation's worth of thinking about China and how we learned that idea is going to be sticky. And I think it's important to kind of tone down the intenseness and go for helping younger Americans understand the conflict. I also think part of the polling I mentioned earlier might be a reflection that the Gen Z is more educated on what climate change is and what's going on with climate change than we are with the very, very controversial and complicated relationship with China, whether it be cybersecurity with China or other issues. So as we get more and more of that exposure and education, it's going to help us form views on our competition with China. I do think the polling is largely showing that not that climate change isn't important, because it is, but that our education in our relationship with China, our competition with China, isn't as expansive as it is in climate change, for example.
Another question. Oh, go ahead, Sam. Are you jumping in here?
Yeah. If I could add to that, I think that in terms of where the polling is with young people now, we could see that change, and it may be reflected already, increasing hostility. I haven't seen it broken down by generations, but we certainly have seen that trend in polling overall. So it's something to be worried about. And I think that there is some enthusiasm that we can see evidence for among different members of the foreign policy establishment and political establishment overall, that a conflict with China might allow us to paper over a lot of the problems that we have here at home, to sort of smooth over the domestic conflicts and differences by embracing this frame of great power struggle against China. And I think there are a lot of reasons that that's dangerous and that we need to push back on it. Most recently, we've seen in the context of the coronavirus pandemic how overheated rhetoric about the foreign threat leads to people who can be associated with that being targeted at home. And we've seen that with, I think, escalating racist violence against Asian Americans. So that's reason number one to be concerned about that. But also, I think we will see in embracing this frame of great power competition, a likelihood that it would become a militarized competition, that it would not have the benefits for rebuilding our infrastructure or our economy or just kind of national unity in general, so much as it would have continuing the current over-militarized nature of our foreign policy.
So we've gotten a lot of buzz in our Q&A, and I also had seen some online about one particular issue which could definitely affect young people, which is the prospect of expanding eligibility for the draft beyond men to women as well. As young people who could be drafted, asks Leah Bulger, what do you think of this? How might bringing back the draft affect foreign policy?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think so. I'm gonna preface this with that we should not bring back the draft as like a precursor to answering this question. But if there's going to be a draft, there's some considerations that have to be made. I hope we're never in a space that we need to bring back a draft, and I think our generation in general, like I had said earlier about the idea of military action and being skeptical of America's ability to do it effectively, can hopefully influence not bringing back a draft.
Yeah, I think my answer here might be a little too straightforward because I know that this is a complex issue, but the U.S. should not be having a draft. And if there's no appetite to, for people to sign up for the military, to fight a war overseas, then maybe that's a conflict that the US should not be engaging in anyway. So I think that that's something we should think about. But obviously, there's a lot of people who are more familiar, who can probably have more complex and nuanced responses to that.
I will say that I am not terribly worried about the draft being brought back. I think that the all-volunteer force has, in a lot of ways, given a great advantage to our current method of warfighting, where the vast majority of the nation can simply pretend it's not happening. Once you start drafting people, it would cause public opinion to turn much more quickly against conflicts, but also in a much more meaningful way. I think Americans broadly want the war in Afghanistan to end, but because they're not in danger of being sent there against their will, they're not going to take to the streets over it. And for that reason, you do have some people who want to end endless wars who favor bringing back the draft. I think that's also not a great idea, but I don't think you're likely to see a return of the draft for that and other reasons.
Yeah,
I also think, I think we have a real problem as a country if our way to end a war we've been doing for 20 years is to reinstate a draft so that public opinion actually cares again. I think that would be a terrible solution.
Yeah, and as I understand the literature on drafts and conflict, it basically can extend conflict because it gives the political system a cheap source of labor. And of course, it's very disruptive to the economy. We've got a question from Hilda Restad, who is a scholar of American exceptionalism, and says she's curious to hear our Zoomers' views on American exceptionalism and whether they find it a relevant idea.
I don't think so. I think that the notion of American exceptionalism is eroding away. And I don't think that those foundational myths of how young people think the US should engage with the world are the same. And I think partly that's because we are in this era of these really global challenges and this understanding that the US can't go it alone. And the US in no way is going to be able to do that on its own because it's more special than other countries or somehow unique in that way. And I think we've also seen how the kind of the weaponization of American exceptionalism, this idea of America as this global policeman to bring about progress or peace, has backfired spectacularly. So I think that's really influential in the way that young people see this kind of myth of American exceptionalism.
Layla put it perfectly.
Yeah, I'll just say that to start, per a poll from the Eurasia Group Foundation from last year, I think Gen Z are the first cohort to reject the idea of American exceptionalism as a majority. I think something like 57% rejected it outright. And I think in general, it's a healthy development. As Layla said, the idea of the country having some kind of divinely ordained mission and right to reshape the world in its own image, and the belief that goes hand in hand with that, that our actions are inherently more virtuous than those of others. I think that's been dangerous and destructive, basically for the duration of our country's history. I think we need to work to replace that view of ourselves with something else that is constructive. I don't think we should just allow there to be some kind of vacuum of, identity, but we need to have a vision for how America can play a constructive and cooperative role in solving global problems.
And speaking as the millennial on the panel, this maybe confirms Layla's point about support crumbling, but I think that there is a tradition of American exceptionalism that is found particularly prior to 1898, when the Spanish-American War, and we acquired actual colonies, in which the United States sees itself as something of a city on a hill, providing a light of a model to the world. But as a scholar I'm a fan of, Eugene Goltz, has said, the light doesn't go out and get you. We could provide a model of a free and open society and of what possibilities that might provide to the world, without then going and imposing that or making our society centered around using force against other countries that may have different models. We have a question here from Paul Shannon. If folks maybe have a really quick hit on this. It seems that Gen Z is much less likely to support war, but when it comes to political involvement, Gen Z is getting involved in organizing around climate, racial justice, and identity politics, but there does not seem to be as much involvement in war and peace issues. Is this an accurate perception? Really quick answers here.
I can jump on this really quickly. I think part of that is the amount of exposure, right, that young people have to these issues. And I think the best way to get them more involved in questions about US militarism and foreign policy is to bring it under frames that young people are already passionate about. So one of those is the climate crisis. So if we talk about, the climate crisis in terms of, well, the Department of the Defense emits more carbon than many small industrialized countries, then maybe we get that light bulb switched on in young people's heads. So I think part of that's just meeting people where they are. And I wouldn't say it's because young people aren't interested in these issues. It's just, it hasn't been spoken about or framed in a way that is more directly accessible and easy for them to understand.
All right. Well, with that, we are at time, so I will hand it back to Kelly, who will take us out.
Well, thank you.
By the way, again, I'll make a quick plug for the JQA Society if you're a young person who's interested in being part of this foreign policy change. Sorry, Kelly.
No, I second that. I mean, John, you are doing amazing things with the society, and anybody who is listening on this call, please check out the John Quincy Adams Society, particularly if you're a young person, you're in college, you're getting out of college. The resources and the networking, John, that you provide is just amazing. So thank you so much for this conversation. As a lone Gen Xer on this call, I just want to commend everybody for this high level and very positive conversation. John, you made some really excellent points about the context in which each generation is growing up. And you were spot on about my generation having grown up in a mostly peaceful time where American exceptionalism was still the norm. And you can see that in all of our movies and our music and all of our other popular contexts. So it is a big difference. And you guys are growing up, obviously, in a much different world. But I think from this conversation, I feel great about how you are handling it and responding to it. So thank you so much, everyone, for including our panelists, but also our audience for joining us today. If you want to learn more about the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, please check out our website at quincyinst.org and all the great writing we have on our online magazine, responsiblestatecraft.org. Thank you very much. Okay, that was fantastic, guys. I mean, really, you're getting awesome responses on Twitter, and, I'm getting lots of texts about how great the conversation was. And
amazing. I'm so happy that so many people joined us.
Yeah, that was good.
Questions in the Q&A. So hopefully people reach out on Twitter and be like, yeah,
there was a lot of stuff that we didn't get to in there. There was just a ton of questions. One of the interesting ones I saw about Democratic Republican breakdown among